Thanks. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the second Digital Learning Series webinar of 2022. I know we have folks registered from Europe to Australia, and we're so glad you could join us in a month where I know a lot of people are traveling after spending most of the past 2 years grounded, essentially. My name is Wei Li, and I lead Grow Asia's agri-food innovation and digital work. We are a multi-stakeholder platform catalyzed by the World Economic Forum and ASEAN Secretariat that builds partnerships for inclusive, resilient, and sustainable food systems in Southeast Asia. Our digital program seeks to bridge gaps and facilitate collaboration between the diverse private, public, and development sector stakeholders in our digital community of practice. And I want to thank our primary donor, Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, whose funding makes events like these possible. On to the topic of the hour. I don't think I need to tell this audience that agriculture and forestry are key drivers of GHG emissions, and that sustainable agriculture, protecting existing forests, as well as balanced and healthy diets are among the solutions that offer the highest potentials for climate change mitigation. You have probably noticed an explosion of webinars, events, and reports, particularly recently, that touch on climate smart agriculture, regenerative agriculture, nature-based solutions, and agroecology. And these topics very much intersect with the topic of innovation, as we see precision agriculture and digital climate smart solutions as just some examples of innovations enabling small-scale producers to shift to more sustainable practices. And though definitions do exist for these terms, they're not always standardized or precise and based on clearly agreed upon frameworks, and they intersect with each other. And that's really why we have assembled this diverse panel today to share their views and unique perspectives on these topics. We aim to answer some of your questions and stimulate others, and above all, to encourage thoughtful grappling with these topics and how they're part of enabling a transition to more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive food systems. The agenda for today is pretty simple. We'll have a speaker presentation by the World Economic Forum and a panel discussion as well, which will take us to about 6:15 or 6:20. Next slide, please. Just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any technical issues with Zoom during the session, please send a message to the user that you see padang_admin in the chat, or email community@padang.co. If you have any questions for the speakers, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A box, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. And if you are addressing them to a particular speaker, feel free to put their name in your question as well. The chat box is for you to make comments, introduce yourself, or just share your thoughts. And we will be recording this presentation and posting it on the DLS website, and we'll also be sending you the link to the recording. Next slide, please. So just a quick poll so that you can see, get a better sense of who else is in the room. Could you launch the poll, Ivy? Yeah, really quick question. Where are you based? It's been nice since we've gone virtual, that we've been able to have a lot more representation outside of Singapore and the rest of Southeast Asia, but also outside of Asia as well. And also, if you could answer the second question at the same time, what type of organization do you represent? That would be great. I'm going to wait till we hit past 60% participation to show you the results. Thank you, everyone. So a fairly substantial chunk of folks are from Singapore, but also great representation from outside of Singapore and the rest of Southeast Asia, as well as from the rest of Asia and outside of Asia as well. And a really pretty broad spread between corporates, startups, NGOs, academia as well. Thanks for that. Next slide, please. All right, so we'll move on to the presentation that we have. And let me just briefly introduce Alexia, who is the community lead of food and nature at the World Economic Forum. She brings a wealth of experience from her years in strategy at McKinsey and in sustainable land use and forest protection in East Africa, while at Partnership for Forests. And she'll be sharing with us on transforming food systems with farmers and sharing an experience from the EU. Over to you, Alexia.
There you go. Thank you so much for having me, Wei Li. It's really a pleasure, as well as the team at Padang & Co. and others, to be here. So maybe if we directly go into the content, because I know we have a packed agenda, if we move to the next slide. The insights I'm going to be sharing today were generated through the 100 Million Farmers platform, which is a platform basically that was launched at the World Economic Forum and aims to support private and public leaders to work directly with the farmers to accelerate the transition to net zero, nature positive, and farmer resilient food systems. Basically by scaling regenerative and climate smart agriculture to approximately 20% or this tipping point in farmer base, and improving the business case of doing so. And one of the key ways that we're doing that is by building these pre-competitive action partnerships or coalitions. And one of them is based in Europe. And this is the EU Carbon Plus coalition that has approximately 13 different partners working directly with the farmers. And if we move to the next slide, what this coalition started by doing is by asking a question like, what are the key barriers that farmers today are experiencing when we're talking about the transition towards climate smart or regenerative agriculture? So we did this extensive survey with approximately 1,600 farmers across 7 different countries that are really representative of the European basin of farmers, because it has 75% of the farmers in Europe, but also a good representation of the agricultural production. And it led us to certain insights that we published in a report that I'll be happy to share the link later on. So if we move to the next slide, the findings that these generated, well, they come across, we also recognize that there is a broad spectrum of practices when we're talking about climate smart agriculture. And I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but it's true really to show that there's no single common accepted definition out there, but we've really decided to go quite broad in our definition to accept any of these practices that actually have outcomes that are positive for nature, climate, and people in doing so. So moving on to the next slide, the findings that we had in this report and in this survey really showed that there's pain points across 5 main categories for the farmers. And I'll go deeper into each one of these 5 categories as we go throughout the presentation. So maybe if we go directly to the next slide, the first and main barrier that were mentioned by the farmers were around the Pharma Economics. And so we found that farming is actually very economically challenging. Farmers receive approximately 60% less income than a non-farming family. And this means that it's very challenging, and we cannot accept farmers to bear the full cost and the potential risk of the transition on their own. And when looking at Asia, it's probably even more so the case that it's even more challenging for farmers. Therefore, we really have to offer as stakeholders the potential tools, financial and economical tools, but also insurance for the farmers to go through the transition. If we move on to the second barrier, it was around awareness and knowledge. Going a bit too fast there. So around awareness and knowledge. And so it's the following slide, just for the team to know. And one thing that we found is that despite there being very high interest from the farmers on what is carbon farming, what is climate smart farming, only 1 out of the 4 farmers that were surveyed mentioned they have a good or very good understanding on what these practices are. And so this is a critical barrier to adoption. And it means that also the information that is available for farmers is below par. And we could do the very strong assumption that for Southeast Asia, this still holds very true, and that inaccessibility to key information might be a very important barrier to address. If we move on to the third barrier around data and technology, one key thing that we saw, if we move to the next slide, is that there is actually low adoption of digital impact measurement tools, but also of digital farm management tools. And so we know that these tools might be very helpful in the adoption of climate smart and regenerative agriculture because they allow the rewarding of these practices for the farmers for the outcomes they can be achieved. And so helping farmers in their MRV or impact measurement journey might be incredibly powerful. And so Southeast Asia is likely to demonstrate similar insufficient digital infrastructure with also a big national disparity. So if we move to the fourth barrier now, so the next slide around policy environment, here what we did is we extracted a few learnings from the EU policy landscape that might be helpful for other geographies as well. First is that it's very important to promote regional policy alignment in order to increase the ability to scale. So what we've seen in Europe is that despite their having this common agriculture policy, the national implementation really relies on the national ambition, and therefore this creates a huge difference between what is done in one country and what is done in the others. And this, for example, might inhibit the ability of businesses or frameworks that are trying to do a cross-regional framework for their ability to scale. The second is around maximizing ambition and inclusivity of the subsidies and policies that are put into place. Despite the EU Common Agricultural Policy wanting to be greener, there's been little evidence that they have succeeded in doing so. And two main reasons is that first, their ambition sometimes was not up to par, and this has significantly changed with this round of the CAP. But second, also that most of the smallholder farmers are not able to access the payments available, as most of the payments go on a hectare basis and are rewarding larger scale farmers. Third is around encouraging hybrid payment frameworks. And what we mean by this is by encouraging the rewarding of both practice uptake, but also outcome-based payments. Because during the transition might take time and the outcomes might only be seen later on in the stage. And so it's important to encourage action early on and to help the farmers invest in those practices. And fourth and fifth is that investing in geospatial analysis and harmonizing monitoring frameworks is something that the European Union is doing a lot and might be very helpful across the region. And finally, promoting interministerial policy alignment to avoid any counterproductive subsidies or policies being implemented. And Southeast Asia could actually use a similar common regional blueprint to encourage different countries to go along the same journey. And moving on to the fifth and final barrier that we found is that, if we move on to the next slide, is that farmers are incredibly diverse across different countries, and this requires a fine balance between standardization of solutions and localization of solutions. And this in Europe has been significant, but potentially in Southeast Asia, we might see a more homogeneous pattern, and maybe smallholder farmers that are more agile and flexible. So maybe this is something the region could leverage to their benefit. So if we move to the next slide, what we did with all these findings is that now with the 12 different partners in the coalition, we're building a whole roadmap and a transformation program to address these barriers in Europe, and we're planning to start implementation in the Q4 of 2022. Very excited to do so, and we're working together with the EU Commission and getting feedback from the young farmers as well in Europe, and so we're very excited. And now we're planning to launch together with our Food Innovation Hub partners to launch a similar coalition in Vietnam. We're talking with GrowAsia as well as with MART, so the Ministry of Agricultural and Rural Development, and very excited to be launching. If you have any questions or would like some information on what the 100 Million Farmers is doing in other regions, do feel free to reach out. Over to you, I think, Shivan or Weili.
Thanks so much, Alexia. And we wanted to take questions for Alexia, but I think just in the interest of time, we're going to transition to the panel, which Alexia will also be on. So please put your questions, continue to put your questions in the Q&A. Let me quickly introduce Shivan, our moderator, to you. Shivan's an experienced consultant, having served as a senior manager at Alpha Beta's Singapore office, and he co-leads Alpha Beta's research and engagement on sustainability, including the future of business and biodiversity, food and alternative proteins, nature-positive agriculture, and nature-positive cities. And so let me hand the floor and the panel over to his capable hands. Thanks, Shivan.
Thank you so much, Whaley. And thank you to Alexia for her presentation. And once again, to the Grow Asia and Padang & Co teams for organizing this webinar. And to our terrific audience today, many more of you have streamed in since we took that poll at the start. I'm sure you're already enjoying this much needed session. And the next hour or so presents a chance now for us to really get deep into the topic of climate smart, regenerative and nature-based solutions for agriculture. And I know that regardless of time zone, it's likely that we're the only thing keeping you between, we're the only thing between you and your next meal, which hopefully is planet friendly. And that's tough competition, but with our lineup of terrific panelists, I assure you it will be well worth the wait. But before we introduce them and begin demystifying today's topic, I would like to just ask one more poll question, which you should be seeing on your screens any minute now. If you aren't seeing it yet, the question is, do you work in or does your work involve climate smart agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, nature-based solutions, all of the above, or none of the above? And we'll just give a few seconds for answers to stream in. Please do put your answers on now. It'll definitely be interesting to see how many of those potential no's we could convert to yeses at the end of this session. All right, then. Fair amount of familiarity, I suppose. 34% of you are familiar with all of them, 16% none of them. Most of you are very familiar with climate smart agriculture. Interesting. All right, let's move on to our speakers now. Thank you to the Padang team, Padang & Co team for that poll. So on to today's panel, we're thrilled to have with us 4 speakers. First, we have Dimas Fauzi, who is a research associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Second, we have Erika Baltarelli, who is the founder of the Sustainable Smallholder. Third, we have Patty Chu, who is the managing director at Mana Impact Partners. And finally, we also have Alexia Samov, who will be joining us back again. You just heard from Alexia. She's the community lead for food and nature at the World Economic Forum. Right. Through this session, we will explore each of these panelists' expertise areas in relation to the topic of climate smart agriculture in turn, spending about 8 to 10 minutes per panelist, before rounding off with some closing remarks and spend 15 minutes for questions and answers from the audience. Audience, please feel free to keep your questions coming in throughout this session. We will be looking to incorporate some of your questions even prior to that session at the end. And many thanks to a few of you who have submitted your questions at the time of registration. All right, then, let's get started first with Dimas, who today is wearing, among his many hats, the representation of the scientific community. And Dimas, we are looking to you to first help clarify these concepts in agroecology, climate smart, regenerative, and nature-based solutions in agriculture, which I'm sure, based on that poll, a few clarifications would be helpful. I know a definition is tough, Dimas, but could you please help clarify what these 4 terms mean for our audience?
Right. Thanks so much for inviting me as well to this excellent webinar. I think when it comes to definition, I think it's quite broad, and sometimes a lot of these terms, they are not very much like well defined, and then different actors may have different definitions on all of these terms. So, but at the bottom line of these 4 different terms like agroecology, climate smart agriculture, and nature-based solutions, and also regenerative agriculture, they are basically umbrella terms that capture varying sustainable and climate-friendly agricultural practices. For instance, like for agroecology, initially it was like widely used widely used to define the agroecosystems, but then it's right now it's kind of like expanding towards to look into the wider food system. So it touches not only on the ecological aspect of agriculture, but also economics and social dimensions as well. And as a matter of fact, FAO, through its the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition, or known as HLPE, they've come up with these 13 principles of agroecology that covers both ecological and economic aspects such as yields, biodiversity, soil health, and also economic and social cultural principles such as economic diversification, fairness, social value, etc. And then some of the examples of agroecology, for instance, include such as cover crops, agroforestry, organic farming, and many other agricultural practices that are more environmentally sustainable. And when it comes to climate smart agriculture, also known as CSA, so the focus, I think, is mostly on the enhancement of food security in the age of climate change. So the agricultural practices that fall under climate smart agriculture should not really harm the environment. And normally climate smart agriculture also uses the advanced technologies to increase yields, adapt to the climate extremes, and also like to contribute in mitigating climate change. And examples of climate smart agriculture include organic fertilizers, low energy cropping tools, and new crop variants that is climate resilient, and then many other agriculture practices. And the third term is the regenerative agriculture. And I think the main focus of the regenerative agriculture is mainly to improve soil health, ecosystem, carbon sequestration, and also biodiversity. So it's part of mostly on the ecological outcomes. Although there's no agreed definition on regenerative agriculture based on the literature, but I think the ecological outcome is something that's more appealing within this practice. Some of the examples include tillage reductions in the use of cover crops, and then these practices are quite similar as well with the agroecology that I've mentioned earlier. And finally, there is nature-based solutions for agriculture. And so the nature-based solution itself is quite new, and it's initially used for the climate mitigation and adaptation, and it's also applicable in the agricultural sector. And the focus is not only on the biophysical aspects of agricultural impacts on climate change, but also touching on the socioeconomic aspects of it, such as the productivity enhancement. So the examples of the practices under nature-based solution for agriculture include conservation agriculture, cover crops, and then this also, like as I mentioned, is are quite similar to the agroecological practices. So I think something that I would like to highlight here is these four terms, they carry both process and also outcomes. When it comes to process, it refers to the agricultural practices, the specific agricultural practices that are environmentally friendly, that are sustainable, that are climate resilient, such as the organic farming, tillage, agroforestry, etc. And when it comes to outcomes, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's like how these agricultural practices could actually improve the environmental health, does not really harm the environment, improve food security, and improve the climate resiliency as well. So I think when it comes to these different terms, I think there is process, there is outcomes as well, and we need to focus our attention as well on the outcomes because, as you know, that some of the practices are actually overlapping. They may fall under different terminologies. It can fall under climate smart agriculture, and it can also fall under other terms such as agroecology or something else. I will stop here, I think.
Thank you, Dimas. I know those were hard to sort of explain because of their various different overlaps within them, but can I just pose one quick question to you? Would it be fair to say that all of these terms are part of a broader sort of umbrella of nature positive agriculture? Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I would say it's leaning towards that. So yeah, it's definitely supporting sustainable agriculture, like nature positive kind of direction.
Excellent. Okay, cool. I think that makes a lot of sense. That there are aspects of, and this was a question that was also asked on the chat at the moment, there are aspects of regenerative agriculture, for example, that are not necessarily just climate smart, they're also nature smart. And we know that the links between biodiversity and climate change addressal are strong, but they are distinct at times as well. So thank you for that. So let me just ask you a quick question as a follow-up to those definitions. In your experience, how widespread is the understanding and use of these terms in different circles? So thinking about, say, academia and scientific community, of course, but also say in donor communities, in investment communities, with the private sector, with government stakeholders. How sort of different is the understanding of these terms between these stakeholders?
Yeah, I think each term has like different kind of like popularity, quote unquote, among different stakeholders. Like, so for instance, like agroecology is probably initially more kind of like spread among the academic community, but then like right now it's also promoted as a kind of like development intervention to promote sustainable agriculture. That's something that SAI is also involved in the mainland Southeast Asia. But then, and then for the climate smart agriculture, I think it's a little bit more kind of well known across different stakeholders because of like the use of advanced technologies that also appeal to the private sector, startups, investors, etc. And then, as a matter of fact, in the international organizations such as ASEAN, they also have they have already kind of like developed these guidelines on climate smart agricultural practices. While for the regenerative agriculture and natural-based solutions, they are relatively increasingly in kind of the popularity among the international organizations, donors, and also the governments. But as I mentioned earlier, I think what we need to focus here is rather on the outcomes of these different practice of different kind of like terminologies. Because when it comes to agricultural practices, there are a lot of like bunch of different sustainable agricultural practices that may fall under multiple terms. But then when it comes to outcomes, they are actually leading to the kind of like same direction. So when we can focus on the outcomes, I think that's one way to move forward, I'd say.
Awesome. Thanks, Dimas. And on that track of outcomes, what do you think the outcomes we should be looking for in Southeast Asia are with respect to these terms, or broadly food systems transitions that focus on actual agricultural production? What are some of the outcomes that you see being most important?
So definitely food security is one of like the ultimate outcomes that we need to kind of consider when implementing this sustainable agriculture. And then we also need to think about like the ecological, environmental aspect of agricultural practices, like what are, is there any negative impacts of certain agricultural practices, and then like how we can kind of like transition or transform these agricultural practices into something that is more sustainable. So there should be like a combination between both like ecology, environment, biodiversity with the other social aspects. Because sometimes when it comes to the transition in agricultural sector, it means that the farmers, they will also need to kind of change their practice. And when they change their practice, it will definitely affect their livelihood, and how we can ensure that the farmers' livelihood are not affected when they are transitioning towards more sustainable agricultural practices. So yeah, I think outcomes will be quite varied, but it should incorporate like both kind of like biophysical or environmental aspects and also like social economic aspect as well.
Well, terrific. Many thanks, Dimas, for that. That's a terrific setup for this panel. I'm a bit conscious of time, and we do have a ton of different speakers to go through. So we'll be back to you, Dimas. There's questions streaming in for you. I promise you that. All right, next we will be turning to Erica, who, with her vast experience, I would say, in corporates, NGOs, government, consultancy, and startups, established the Sustainable Smallholder in 2021, which is an organization that offers startups, SMEs, social enterprises support to develop regenerative agricultural solutions, and it focuses not only on Southeast Asia but also India and Sub-Saharan Africa. Erica, we will be looking to you to translate some of these terms that Dimas has shed light on now to action in Southeast Asia, continuing on that last thread with Dimas, focusing on aspects of innovation. So to start off with, could you share how your experience at the Sustainable Smallholder on developing some solutions that we would classify under these different categories? How are they being tested and implemented with Asian farmers? And what has been the role of innovation and digital solutions in doing so?
Thanks, Shivan. I'm more than happy to give a couple of really concrete examples. I would like to start off by saying that the examples that I've chosen are actually examples that have been really transformational in the field. So in other words, back to the outcomes, really have had impact from an economic, social, and environmental perspective. The second reason why I've chosen for these particular examples is because, as we saw earlier, not one concept is the silver bullet. So there are so many overlapping aspects between regenerative, nature-based, climate smart. And actually, when you look at implementation in the field with a smaller farmer, what you actually do is you mix and match different products and different practices and different social systems that you actually then can implement within that particular crop, within that particular farmer segment, and within that particular agroecological zone. What that means is just a really nice term for where are we having, where is the field base? Is the mountain with less water, or is it a lowland with easy access to water? So that just to set the context. So one of the examples I would like to share is in coffee, and then later on we did the same in coconut. And basically what we needed to do is we needed to increase yields and return of investment for these women coffee and coconut farmers in an environmental sustainable way. And so what we did is actually started to apply agroforestry and syntropic farming principles to their coffee farms. Now, again, to make things really simple, what does that mean? That means that you start actually mimicking a forest, but then with coffee trees. So what you do is, for example, you start planting shade trees that are higher than coffee, because then coffee grows better. What you do is you start intercropping. So you start planting different crops to have an extra set of income for the farmer. But also because some of these crops, especially some legume varieties, they can actually fixate nitrogen in the soil. Again, to make things very simple, what does that mean? That your soil becomes healthier. And when your soil is healthier, your plant grows better. It will have more microbes in the soil. It's more fertile, and you have higher yields, and you store more carbon. Other things that we did, which was really, really cool, is we also looked at the processing and the waste side of it. So when you talk about regenerative farming, you also look at it from a very holistic perspective, because as Dimas also alluded to, it's a circular concept. So we also looked at waste management and water processing. So from a waste management perspective, for example, we kind of discovered that you also can use old coffee as fertilizer. What we also discovered is you can use the green pulp of the coffee berry before you get to the real coffee that we drink. You can actually process that into pulp and then process that into a drink that is called cascara, which is a really high antioxidant drink that is obviously you can have very high value extraction from that in markets such as Western Europe and America. And then another example that I would like to share is an example that is more focused on climate smart. What I mean by that is, and we also saw that in Alexia's presentation, climate smart inputs. So I would really like to focus on something called climate smart seed varieties. Companies like Syngenta, Corteva, and Bayer have been extremely good at developing a very good pipeline of these so-called hybrid seeds. And these hybrid seeds include traits such as, and this is within the rice example, traits such as drought tolerance. So with this type of rice, for example, you can plant this rice and you don't have to have so much water, still the rice will grow well and still the rice will yield. Traits such as salinity, anti-salinity. So especially what we start seeing in major parts of coastal ASEAN, take Vietnam, the salinity is becoming a huge problem. And so these varieties, they actually have a tolerance against salinity. So that's when you then start getting into shrimp and rice farming type of concepts, which are really, really not only regenerative, but is extremely economically profitable for the farmer. And so we have been working with the sustainable smallholder as well with Corteva Agri-Science to actually put together a pilot in Vietnam on sustainable rice production, not only using these climate smart varieties, but then as well putting an innovative business model in action on how to educate and inform step by step and continuously season after season these smallholder farmers on how to produce sustainable rice. Let me pause here to see if you have any further questions, and hopefully these examples have been able to clarify what this concept means in the real world.
Thank you, Erica. Definitely. And I think you kind of answered a couple of questions I had as follow-up as well. So thank you for being a soothsayer there. What I will just quickly point to and encourage a very quick answer on this is, because you've already kind of touched on it, there's a question from the audience on how competitive are the outputs of the examples you've spoken about when compared with conventional agriculture? Do they need to be supported by subsidies or ecosystem payments at this point, or are they competitive on their own?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's actually the key question when we talk about transitioning to regenerative agricultural practices. So what you see in the real life is there always will be a yield gap, always. Because when you transition to new practices, whether it's regenerative or whether it's any other practice, there is a period of learning and there's periods of adjustment of the soil. So you have a yield gap. Now, the key question that the entire world needs to answer is, how do we finance that? Do we finance that with external finance? Are there any innovative finance mechanisms? Does carbon finance pose a solution? Not sure. Maybe not now. Or can the yield remain the same versus conventional agriculture? Now, to answer the question, what you see is that this is very different per crop in very different agroecological zones. So I have seen certain regenerative projects in rice in India having the exact same yield as conventional farming. But then what you see is the upside is a higher return of investment for the farmer, because obviously he needs less investment for chemical fertilizers or anything else. But I also have seen difference in Vietnam, for example, in the northern part of Vietnam, in the Red River Delta, where it took about 3 seasons to get back to the conventional agriculture benchmark that they have within that zone. So summarizing, it depends based on crop, based on zone, based on the education of the farmer. But on average, you could almost argue that within 2 to 3 seasons, which can be 1 to 1.5 years in calendar time, 2 to 3 seasons, regenerative ag, when implemented in a simple way, can basically get back to the conventional farming level yields. And then after that, exponentially increase up to 20 to 30% higher yields.
Sounds good. And I think that's a very direct answer to the question. So thank you for that, Erica. And just before we switch over to the next speaker, Erica, I know that there was one topic you wanted to touch on, which was, moving beyond technological innovation. What sort of social and economic innovation is important for these solutions? I would love for you to just give us, if you can, a 60-second download on what your top thoughts are on that, please.
Thanks, Shivan. Yes, I think this is very much a topic that is underestimated and we don't talk about it enough. And it's especially when you want to implement these green technologies with smallholder farmers. We need to incorporate the voice of the farmer. And what I mean by that is co-creation with the farmer in the field. That is absolutely essential. I cannot stress that enough. But I still don't see it happening to the scale of which it should be happening. So again, incorporation of the voice of the farmer does not mean sitting in an office and looking at a market research report. It means going out into the field, getting your feet and hands dirty. Let's talk to the smaller farmers. Let's really do rapid prototype development with them, whether it's conceptual, whether it's extremely concrete. Let's pilot with them, and then you can implement. And then I can assure you that because they've been empowered and their legacy knowledge and their deep knowledge of their own crops has been included, it will be sustainable, not only environmentally, but as well economically and socially.
Terrific. Thank you, Erica. And that it's such a critical point to sort of reinforce that oftentimes we sit in webinars like this and think of terrific solutions that don't always make sense. So, speaking to and engaging with the communities that are directly, working with the earth is incredibly important. And I really thank you for shedding light on that. And thank you for the broader insights that you've shared in your speaking time in the last few minutes. helps us move in the direction of building that kind of roadmap for these solutions in Asia that we are looking to do. And we would like to now continue on with Patricia or Patty, who will be helping us continue by focusing on the investment side of the picture, in particular referencing her experience at Manna Impact Partners, which seeks to leverage impact investment to catalyze a more circular and regenerative agroeconomic system. Patty, now just opening question to you is, could you give us a sense of how keen impact investors and say family offices are to invest in climate smart, regenerative and nature-based agriculture, please?
Yeah, thanks, Shivin. Yeah, I mean, at Manna, I think we're very fortunate to work with a number of family offices and help deploy and manage their impact investment portfolio, specifically for regenerative agriculture and nature-based solutions. Having said that, I wouldn't say that this is the norm for most family offices, at least here in Asia. I would say that it's a lot more common to see that in their investment portfolio, they have probably ag-tech solutions or alternative protein or cell-based meat investments. And, you know, some of them consider that those type of investments as climate smart as well. So having said that, I think I remain positive. I think that there is a lot more awareness. I think just as, you know, Wei Ling shared in her opening that there's a lot more talk about the regenerative agriculture. And I think that people are connected, not only the role of regenerative agriculture in terms of climate mitigation and, you know, adaptation purposes, but also health, which may be a sort of you know, a narrative or to get more people, you know, interested in investing in this area as well.
Thank you, Patty. And I think that one question that we would love to kind of dive into is what are the sort of perceived risk factors in these types of investments? I know you're going to be speaking from the impact investors and sort of family offices perspective, but I do have a suspicion that some of these risk factors would be common to other stakeholders as well. So keen to just get your thoughts there.
Yeah, sure. I think that, you know, agriculture in general has been always viewed as a riskier sector. So I think if you look at it, investments across different sectors, probably, yeah, you know, it's less the amount of investment seen. So when one talks about regenerative agriculture, given that it is, you know, relatively newer term, the immediate perception is that it's even riskier. However, I think as many of us know in the panel and in this group perhaps, that regenerative agricultural practices can lead to more resiliency and, you know, in the longer or medium long term, actually have improvements on the bottom line because of the lower need for inputs. So you're right. I think that the perceived risks are, you know, quite common, I mean, to other industries as well. But one, I think very, you know, one that comes up again and again is probably on scalability. On, you know, we need to feed, I guess, 8 billion people. You know, is regenerative agriculture able to do that? Is that only for the more well-off, fortunate population? Also, I think when we talk about market size or offtake, you know, are consumers ready to pay for the premium price? I think another concern is the longer harvesting period or you know, the kind of timeline of investment. Yeah, so I would say those are some of maybe also common risks in other sectors.
Thanks, Patty. Two big ones coming out from your explanation there for me are the time horizon for the investment and sort of the let's say the dollar value per investment. And you know, there's some really interesting sort of investment models and financial channels and products that are being developed to sort of engender this capital that we need to unlock the full potential of these solutions. Could I just ask you to maybe shed light on some specific investment models or products that hold a lot of potential and could be potentially more widespread in terms of their application?
Yeah, I think a bit to what Alexia was sharing early on is that, there is no one investment model, or, farmers are very different. So I think the investments are also going to be very different and the model is going to be different. Ultimately, I think from an investment point of view, we're going to be considering the capability of the team to execute, the market opportunity, the product service market fit. But in terms of regenerative agriculture, when, we try to make sure that the investments done for these family offices have additionality. So we also did sort of a mapping of what would be needed. What are the levers that would need to be pushed in order to see a more regenerative agricultural system. And so I think a lot of the things that we uncovered were quite similar to that report that Alexia shared. So from an investment point of view, some of the areas that we look at and have already deployed for these family offices are transition finance. So transition finance vehicles, just like I think some of the previous speakers have highlighted, is a very important need. We also invested in capacity building. One thing is to have the willingness to do so and the financing to do so, but there's no know-how to do so. So investing in, intermediaries and education on how to transition, on how to implement better practices. Another thing we've been looking at is access to markets. So it's great, most farmers are great at what they do at, transitioning and, growing crops, but they are probably not the best marketeers. So we've also looked at opportunities of aggregators, sort of like, Red Mart, sort of that, just focus on sustainable regenerative products. Essentially, how to get the farmers to do what they're best at, and still, be paid for their work. And then the last thing that I would say is really interesting, and we've been, this is probably some of the new things that we've been doing, is investing in MRV, so measurement, reporting, and verification technologies. I think a little bit what the other speakers have been talking about, how that will enable more transparency and also account for, the amount of ecological ecosystem services that the farmers are contributing, and being able to value that, and potentially, hopefully, enter the carbon markets, biodiversity markets.
Gotcha. Thanks, Patty. Lots to kind of dive through there, but one point that you made on potentially having these direct-to-market models that are digitally enabled quite often, including your online marketplaces. These are really, really important solutions, which kind of cut the costs of what that premium is that is in front of consumers, and you absolutely pointed that out correctly as well. That consumers being willing to pay a premium is a big differentiating factor, and reducing that premium is an important part of this entire conversation. And there's a question that was also asked earlier on, which was what technologies are NGOs using to track funding outcomes and monitor progress? You mentioned a little bit about MRV technologies. If I could just throw it to you for 60 seconds to talk about what you're seeing in MRV technologies that you find fascinating, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak about, I guess, one particular company that just comes to my mind because we just recently invested in them, which many of you may know already. It's called Cultiva, Koltiva. And I think that, the founder is very grassroots, comes from the grassroots sector, particular in cocoa business. So I think touched upon that, understanding the community and the farmers. And essentially it's a traceability app. It started as a traceability app a few years ago, and now is moving into more access to finance, because they have all the information of how much the farmers have been producing, that they can now extend, access to credit, to transition. It also has a component around education on it, on, training the farmers. So we're quite excited about that. I don't know if it really addressed the person's question.
I think it did. I think it definitely spoke to where the interest also is in everyone, right? I mean, we could have a lot of these investment vehicles set up, but without any kind of monitoring and sort of evaluation, we're not going to have investors sufficiently excited about it. And that also kind of spoke to another question that we had earlier on whether these are avenues for greenwashing, and maybe that's something we'll say for the broader Q&A. But for the moment, I'd just like to say thank you, Patty. These are really valuable perspectives from the investor's mouth, and again, really important in building that roadmap, which needs to address these barriers very, very imminently. And finally, what I would like to do now is turn back to Alexia from the World Economic Forum, from whom you have heard earlier today. Alexia, we'd love to bring you in now to talk about the importance of maintaining our focus on innovating and financing, not just a lot of these solutions that we talked about today, but broader agricultural transformations as well, despite economic uncertainties, and introduce resilience in agri-food systems. So could you speak to the necessity for agri-food systems to sort of recommit to resilient and sustainable development? Of course, bearing in mind that there are a ton of economic storms that we're weathering today, from the havoc that the Ukraine conflict is wreaking on commodity demand, particularly in Indonesia and palm oil, and the continuing impact of COVID, which has, still made a big dent on our global supply chain. Alexia, please, your thoughts.
Sure, and thanks for having me again. I think these past years have really put our food systems to a test in a way. Between COVID-19, the conflict in Ukraine, supply chain shocks have been felt around the world. And what these shocks have highlighted is the existing fragility of our food systems, from production to consumption. More recently, if we just look at these past weeks in Europe, there has been an exceptionally hot weather, a huge heat wave and drought, and this has again wreaked havoc on the agricultural land and reduced yields. But these events, however dramatic they're only the beginning in a way. Scientists have repeatedly warned us that climate change and related biodiversity loss have already affected the productivity of all agricultural and fishery sectors. And this is going to have negative consequences, and is already having negative consequences on food security and livelihoods. And this situation is only going to worsen as we breach many of our planetary boundaries and tipping points. For example, just 3 crops, wheat, maize, and rice, make up half of the world's food supply. And these crops are extremely vulnerable to extreme weather conditions. So as these droughts and heat waves become more normal, how do we make sure that we not only rely on these crops and that we build in more resilience? And I believe that stakeholders from private and public sector are realizing this urgency. They're realizing that the current model of super efficient, just in time, where volume of calories and price is important above all else, is no longer realistic or what we need. They're also realizing that we need more resilient food systems that have lower environmental footprints, more diversity on the supply sources and the produce, but also more diversity on the consumption, more decentralization, and more agility. In the EU, there has been some conversation initially following COVID and the Ukraine crisis to lower the ambition of the EU Green Deal. However, we have seen strong pushback against that from many of the stakeholders we work on on a day-to-day basis. And the EU Commission, for instance, is still pushing forward many of its strategies it had formally put in place. For example, like the soil strategy or its soil carbon framework, for example. And these are, for example, two pillars that are setting up the enabling environment for a continued push towards a climate smart and regenerative transition. And we're finally also encouragingly hearing from the farmers that we're kind of working with for the solutions and the business action and investments that would allow them to share the costs and the risks of the transition period that we've been hearing throughout the different panel interventions. So just to maybe wrap up, I think that while it might not be fast enough, it's really coming, and the climate resilient system that would ensure that food provision is less vulnerable to climate shocks or to external shocks would also benefit consumers. And even I saw a question around consumer health there, but also it would benefit increasing political stability. So I think there is still this movement, and we definitely have to continue going there.
Thank you, Alexia. I know we're short on time a little bit at the moment, but I think one question that would be good to sort of get your take on is, and this is a question around best practices that we're seeing on the chat board at the moment. And by the way, thank you to everyone whose questions have been streaming in all throughout. Alexia, the question is, are there any best practices that governments in Southeast Asia could sort of learn from markets in the EU? I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing the question a little bit, but that's the sort of gist of it.
So I think just going back to the report, that the learnings that we've seen, right? There are a few key out there. I think one is around making sure, that whatever policies are implemented in one government and ministry is coherent and aligned with the other ministries, so that there's no counterproductive. So taking a more systemic approach to food systems, recognizing that food systems are incredibly complex. They're linked to health, they're linked to education, they're linked to the work, they're linked to the financial system. And so you really need to take this holistic approach and recognize the different interlinkages in between them, not to create any counterproductive policies, but also to leverage the synergies that might come out there. So that's one. Second, I think they're investing in geospatial analysis and monitoring. We would have heard about MRV systems, so monitoring, reporting, and verification. Farmers cannot, and even businesses cannot deal with the multiplication of many different frameworks and systems. So how can we invest in harmonizing? And I think the government can play a key role in that, in demonstrating what they feel is the most comprehensive framework to be put out there, but also invest in geospatial analysis to reduce the cost of those MRV systems, which are right now one of the main barriers for farmers to participate in carbon markets or in ecosystem payment services, because it's extremely expensive to have an MRV system for a farmer. So can we help them reduce the cost of those? So that would be the second point. And third, also, let's make sure, as Erica is saying, that we involve the farmers in the creation of those policies, right? It needs to work on the ground. And if, like, for example, an example from Europe, what we saw is that 75 or 80% of the payments were going to the largest farmers, leaving all the smallholders behind. And that is not a transition that will work or will have the environmental and social impact that we want. So can we involve these stakeholders in the policy making, involve the businesses, and start working with them in policy making? So just a very short, hopefully helpful answer.
Thank you, Alexia. Definitely very, very helpful. And thank you for bringing up the topic of multi-stakeholder action, which very nicely leads into the last bit on closing remarks here from each of the panelists. And I would love each of the panelists to maybe take 30 seconds or so to make their closing remarks. And I'll start with you, Dimas. And what I would ask is, if you could perhaps give your top 3 priorities for multi-stakeholder action in this space moving forward, thinking about the Southeast Asia lens. that would be great. Dimas first, and then Erica.
All right, thanks. So I think the first thing, the first priority that I would like to suggest is that that's for the stakeholders in the region, like to actually take the agricultural practices and identify the kind of gaps in the agricultural practices and which practices need transformation. And it leads to like the monitoring and evaluation also like that will improve the efficiency in the future. And it can be done by various actors, academics, governments, CSOs. And second point that I would like to highlight as well is on the strengthening or the development of regulatory framework that focuses on the outcomes of sustainable agriculture, and that so that it can accommodate like all these different four terms that we discussed earlier, and can be done by national government with assistance from NGOs, international organizations, donors, etc. And the final point that I would like to make is related to market education, especially on sustainable commodities, as it will incentivize like sustainable agricultural practices to be transformed at the farming level, because it as we discussed earlier with other speakers on the premium prices, etc. So I think it will incentivize the farmers to actually transform their agricultural practices. Although we should also consider it as a kind of like temporary strategy until sustainable agriculture becomes the norm, and then the price will catch up during that period of time. So yeah, I think that's the three kind of like points that I would like to highlight, and I would like to also echo Erica's point on the incorporation of farmers' voices into the entire process of these 3 points that I mentioned earlier. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you, Dimas. Over to you, Erica.
Thank you, Shivan. At the risk of sounding like a broken record here, but I would like to emphasize the fact that if we want smallholder farmers to actually adopt and really transform their systems, whether the system is 0.5 acre or 5 acres, or even bigger, what we sometimes see 20 acres, they need a couple of things. They need good technology and seeds. They need financing, as we saw earlier, and they need educational practices. But really in the middle of this triangle is what they need is an incentive. They need, why would they shift? Why would they change? Because they're risking their entire livelihoods. That is something that we need to understand. And so their incentive to shift, actually, we believe we know, and many times we say it is the return of investment that they get, and that is theoretically correct. But again, the only way to find out how we can implement these incentives is if we co-create with them. We co-create the program, we co-create the business model, we co-create how we need to educate, and we co-create how to scale with them from community to community, season after season. So again, the incorporation of the voice on the farmer in really transforming food systems, one community at a time, is critical, and that is also my takeaway of today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica. Patty, over to you.
Yeah, I will speak more from an investment point of view. I think one of the things that it's in my to-do list is also be able to engage more with banks, understand what is it, what kind of sort of guarantees, facilities would enable them or to be more comfortable with providing transition finance. I think that as we've done smaller facilities, but to prove the concept, the financial sustainability of it, but what we need is really a lot more funding. And I think that can only be done when we also engage with the financial system. And so that's an important thing that for us that we're working on. The other thing I think on enabling, it's great to see, the carbon market revivals and potential, ecosystem services payments, but I think probably the funding is not really trickling down to the smallholder farmer level. So creating facilities, working with the right sort of partners that have really, foot on the ground, understanding of the communities and project developers that want to share the revenues with the smallholder farmers. Those are sort of some of the, I guess, financial innovations or new projects that we have in our list. So, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Patty. And last but not least, of course, Alexia, your final thoughts before we turn to the Q&A.
So final thoughts on the top 3 actions for multi-stakeholder collaboration. And I think there are quite a few, but if I had to mention 3, I think the first is around, and we touched upon this multiple times, policy and subsidy reform and shifting. Right now, we know that they're overarchingly counterproductive. How can we actually make sure that we're using public money and public power and effort to do good and to meet our climate and biodiversity and social inclusivity and resilience goals? Second is around can businesses and private sector reshape the way they define success, their key performance indicators, and subsequently, therefore, the way they measure and report impact? I heard something interesting that we should look at beyond return on investment, start looking at risk of inaction. So the same ROI, but used differently. And make sure that companies and private sector are defining the success of their divisions and people to include environmental and social impact, such as water usage, land usage, share of profit earned by farmers. And therefore, naturally, these KPIs will trickle down on the demands of these private sector on their suppliers, but also on the products they give to the consumers. And thirdly, I think that there should be much more collaboration and multi-stakeholder partnerships. Again, recognizing the complexity and systemic approach of food systems and the need for every player in the value chain to leverage the know-how and the learnings of the other player in the value chain, so that we don't create any unintended consequences at any point in time and just create more synergies. So let's partner more together. And that's the approach that the 100 Million Farmers is taking with its value chain action coalitions.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexia. And thank you once again to all of our panelists for patiently walking through the last closing remarks and bearing with me. I promise you don't have to bear with me anymore. You only have to bear with our wonderful audience who have been very, very engaged with us so far. We're going to take now a few questions that we had shortlisted, and we want to start with one that I know, Erica, you wanted to answer. And we would also invite other panelists to answer if they have any thoughts as well. The question was, we know the extensive use of chemical fertilizers in agriculture and its adverse effect on the environment and impact on soil degradation in the long term. What are solutions available that can 100% replace the use of chemical fertilizers? And how do we change the mindset of farmers to make that transition? Erica, over to you.
Thanks, Shivan. So the short answer is yes, this can happen, but over time. So basically the approach will be sequential. You start using less and less fertilizer and start using different other methods. So what are these different other methods? Well, again, there's a myriad of practices here that can be followed. So first of all, farmers can actually make their own compost. There is actually a movement in India called zero budget natural farming that teaches farmers how to make their own compost from cow dung, cow urine, jaggery, and other things. There's also other types of composting that are extremely effective, or mulching, which basically means, after you prune or the old leaves and things that fall, leave it on the ground, and it helps increase naturally the soil health and retain topsoil, or actually build topsoil. There are other methods we talked about also earlier without getting too technical. It's about planting certain species of legumes that can increase carbon and nitrogen in the soil, which are, again, natural fertilizers. And there are different microorganisms that can be used, like from earthworms to different types of bacteria that can be put in the soil and then actually start regenerate the soil from within. So, and there are many others, but just to give you a flavor. So yes, it can be done, but over time. I personally have never seen, either I've never read about a practice whereby from one season to the other, you 100% can replace chemical fertilizer. It can be, but the yields would go down too much. Then to your second part of the question is what is the mindset of the farmer? Well, again, the farmer needs an incentive to do this. Otherwise, again, why would he change? His livelihood is on the line. So unless we can show him that it works, so usually seeing is believing works really well with farmers. That's why many times fully digital approaches with smallholder farmers don't work. They always need to be digital. There needs to be a face-to-face component with a demo farm or something where the farmer can actually see with his own eyes and learn how to do these big transitions. And at the same time, as I said earlier, it needs to be some type of incentive whereby over time, after first couple of seasons, he sees that his return of investment is going to be higher. So maybe not necessarily the yield, but because his investment is less in inputs such as chemical fertilizer or pesticides, he can basically save and hence have more return of investment. Before closing, there is one other thing that I wanted to mention, which is important, which I forgot earlier. The use actually of biostimulants. Actually, some of the biostimulants, whether they're algae-based or not, actually, when rightly used on the right crop, they can sometimes reduce chemical use of chemical fertilizers, but up to 80%. And so that's why nowadays you're seeing that the biostimulants market is pretty much booming, especially in countries such as India, very much starting in Indonesia and in Vietnam as well. So yeah, back to you, Shivan.
Thank you, Erica. Any quick comments from other panelists on that question? I don't see that. I'm going to move on to one other question I'm keen for panelists, particularly those who work with Southeast Asian governments, to answer. And the question is, are there best practice markets in Southeast Asia where governments have played an active role in putting in place processes, policies, and infrastructure to enable and encourage regenerative agriculture, and what are potential learnings? Would any of our panelists want to answer that question?
Probably not specifically on the regenerative agriculture, but on other types of sustainable agricultural practices. So something that I've been working on was also on the agroforestry. And then initially, I think in some of the countries, the government has kind of like enacted regulations on, we call it as social forestry, or also known as community-based forest management. And then it incorporates like various details from land tenure until the agriculture practices that can be implemented within this social forestry or community-based forest management. And within this particular aspect as well, the government also has some kind of agribusiness model by which the farmers can actually adopt, and then it will normally require kind of like farmers associations to work on this kind of agribusiness approaches. And then the government also through the regulations, especially they require some of because in the context of social forestry and forests, and then in the context of agroforestry more specifically, they will require some like tree plantings and then some of other conservation kind of measures that the farmers should also implement at the same time. I'm not sure about the regenerative agriculture, but it is as in terms of other sustainable agricultural practices. I think agroforestry or community-based forest management can be kind of like a good example of how the government can actually put everything from the conservation to kind of economic development and also agribusiness development into a single regulation that kind of works for this particular kind of agricultural practices.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Dimas. And if I could also just add a quick point on top of that is a lot of the really cool action on the government side tends to happen at the subnational level. So we've seen actually in a lot of commodity producing hotspots that have also been deforestation hotspots in the past, there are new landscape and jurisdictional approaches that involve government, that involve CSOs, smallholders, as well as corporate sector to actually build sustainable long-term landscape approaches. And there's a ton of different publications on this, which we can share. But for the moment, I do want to turn to another question. Maybe we'll take two more before we finish the session. And this one is for Patty. This was directly addressed to you, Patty. It is, You mentioned transitional finance. Could you elaborate a bit more on your insights about microfinancing in Southeast Asia and its current commercial resilience? Patty, please.
Yeah, I think maybe just to clarify what I meant with transition finance is a bit what I think Erica mentioned in terms of practices that, from we've seen that it takes about 3 years for farmers or for the land to recover, so detoxify. And so, when a farmer goes to a bank to say, well, I don't know what's going to look like exactly, but there are 3 years where I am going to be detoxifying and I'm not going to be receiving the yields and the income that, the past have been. So as a banker, it's a lot of risk, the unknown. So there aren't many facilities in the world, this is not only in Southeast Asia, that would provide that financing. So that's a big pain point. So how this connects to microfinance, I wouldn't say that, I've left that space for a while now, but what I've seen is that, unfortunately, I think in Southeast Asia and many other countries, the lending for agricultural purposes to smallholder farmers is still quite limited. And so I wouldn't be able to comment on its commercial resilience. I do think that, the typical sort of microfinance loan is monthly repayment. And so that definitely doesn't fit the farmer needs because of it should be sort of, mapped or timed with the harvest and all those things. But I think in general, I think it is true that there's just very limited financing opportunities for farmers and smallholder farmers. And so that's a really, I think, important piece for the financial sector to be involved in.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you for that. And final question. I know we're looking at 5 minutes over already, but this is, I think, an important one before we close off. And Erica, it was addressed to you, but I would encourage other panelists also to provide their thoughts if they have. The question is there a good example of how farmers have been incentivized and involved on the ground as co-creators of multi-stakeholder sustainable agriculture practices? Erica, please, first to you.
Thanks, Shivan. It's a question that goes right into my heart and my passion. So short answer, yes, there are many actually, and that is what we are working on. So for example, we have been co-creating a program with Syngenta on how to get farmers to apply sustainability standards in rice. And so we started actually to partner with different companies across the chain. So from education to water management, for example, solar powered irrigation, down to post-harvest. And together with them, we put together some hypothesis on how the program could look like. And then with an NGO and with our own field reps that already have very nice relationship with farmers, we have started to do community conversations. The key of having these community conversations that in the end are the co-creation sessions is that there should not be any commercial purpose behind it. Obviously, by the end, everybody will have their value in whatever form you want to define value, to Alexia's point earlier made. But the co-creation should be without a commercial objective. Usually it's moderated by the chief of the community or the tribal lead, or somebody or the lead farmer that then has been educated by either the company or by us, for example, since a couple of months. The thing that I want to say is that these processes take time. So I think co-creation it's not the silver bullet, but it is part of the answer on how we can transform, but it takes time. So for example, in this instance, it took up to 6 months. But then when we piloted, the yields were incredible. The farmer uptake was 80% in a village, which has never been seen before, because usually the tipping point is about 40%, or the maximum adoption rate. And the scale up has been immense. There are many other examples, but I would love to have as well other panelists comment, please.
Thank you, Erica. Do we have any of our other terrific speakers to contribute to this one?
I think
Alexia.
we're short on time, and Erica has stated everything. So I think I have nothing to add about that.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Alexia. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Dimas, and thank you, Patty, for all of your time that you have spent with us this evening, or this morning for you, Alexia. I think this has been a terrific session where we've gotten to know a ton more on this topic, and I'd like to thank the audience as well for asking all of the terrific questions that were pouring in, made my cognitive load very, very minimal, and that's always excellent as a moderator. So my personal thanks to you for that. I'd like to throw it over now to Adam from the Padang & Co team for final remarks before we close off the session. And thank you again to everyone for staying 10 minutes longer than we have budgeted. It just goes to show that even in the age where panels are encouraged to be short and sweet, we've had to go over because there's been so much engagement pouring through. So thank you to everyone for your very, very active participation. Adam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shivan, for such a great job, and to all of the panel. We've been very lucky in the last 4 years that we've partnered with Grow Asia to have the opportunities through the digital learning series to showcase a lot of different technologies to support smallholder farmers. But I think it's great today the way we could step back for a moment and look at climate smart, regen agriculture, nature-based solutions, and sort of get to better understand them, what the terms mean, and most importantly, what are some of the obstacles, and equally, if not more importantly, how do we finance the adoption of such methodologies and approaches? So, Alexia, thanks for joining us and giving us the European view. I think that's also given us something to build on of relevance and what we can do in Southeast Asia. Dimas, for unpacking the terms, showing the differences, but showing the commonalities. Erica, the voice of the farmer came out loud and clear, and no one better to present it. Patty, I think finance for transition, we've talked about many times. To me, that's just such a key takeaway from what you were showing us, and also giving us an insight to what family offices and impact investors are looking for. And again, Alexia, coming back and sort of pulling together in terms of linkages and harmonizing, a couple of key words. And again, Shivan, thank you for pulling it all together in such a great way. And I think you actually just said it as you introduced me. It's about engagement. I think we had great engagement today, but at the core of all the comments, if I'm trying to find one kind of word of what everyone was saying, we ultimately have to get back to engagement. It's engaging with the financiers, and it's engaging with the farmers, it's engaging with the community as we are here today. So it was a great session for me. It was a great session, I'm sure, for everyone. Thank you to all the panelists. And now the audience, if I could ask you just one last thing as Ivy launches our final poll for the day. Please let us know how you felt about it. Whaley and I get to work now, and we're planning DLS 3, which will be in the next quarter. So just give people a chance to complete the survey. And then I'd like to, on behalf of Padang & Co and Grow Asia, wish you all a great evening and look forward to the next session. Thank you for joining us. Good night.